Author's note. Ever since I learned that women first won the vote in the Western states, I have been fascinated with the 72-year struggle for American women's suffrage. I realized that I had never read about women's suffrage in my college history courses, so I set out to learn all I could. I wanted to find a real girl to write about, and eventually I found the Keith McHenry Pond family papers at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. Inside boxes and cartons were Bessie's journals, newspaper articles about her family's hiking, and the suffrage collection of her aunt, Mary McHenry Keith. My hand shook as I read letters from my hero, Susan B. Anthony, to Aunt Mary. Marching with Aunt Susan is based on actual events in the 1896 campaign. The quote from Susan B. Anthony's speech at Golden Gate Auditorium was one she often used. The version of My Country 'Tis of Thee that Bessie sings in the parade was written by Elizabeth Harnett and performed at suffrage meetings around the country. This story is my chance to march with Aunt Susan and to thank her, Bessie, Aunt Mary, and the hundreds of thousands of women who won the vote for me and for you. Bessie. Bessie Keith Pond was a real girl who lived in Berkeley, California in 1896. She had two older brothers, Enoch, and Charlie. Her father Charles was a naval commander. Her mother Emma was a painter and poet who invented the board game Constitution. Bessie grew up in a family of avid suffragists. Her grandmother, mother, and especially her aunt Mary McHenry Keith, who was a leader in both California campaigns. Aunt Mary was the first California woman to graduate from law school and the wife of the well-known landscape painter William Keith. She became close friends with Susan B. Anthony during her 1895 and 1896 trips to California. In 1905, when Anthony returned for one last trip to California, Uncle Willie painted her portrait. Bessie wrote poetry and taught art and music all her life. For many years, Bessie, her father, and her brothers took month-long mountain hikes and snowshoe trips in the Sierra Nevada mountains, sometimes up to 300 miles. This was so unusual that the family was often featured in the newspaper. An article in the June 24th, 1927 edition of the San Francisco Call described Bessie as an athletic girl with a fondness for outdoor life. Keith Pond, 1886 to 1955. California Suffrage Campaign. In 1895, the California legislature agreed to let men vote on an amendment to the state constitution in support of women's suffrage. That year, Susan B. Anthony traveled to California to help get the referendum on the ballot and returned in May 1896 to lead the campaign for the November election. Hundreds of suffragists across the state organized meetings in every town. Anthony spoke up to 30 times a day at picnics, schools, factories, military encampments, farmers markets, church conventions, labor meetings, women and men's clubs, and even pool rooms. Women and girls worked at headquarters around the state, and working women stopped by after work to donate money or take home an armload of circulars to fold and address at night. Rallies and tea parties like the ones in the story took place from May through November, along with dinner parties, including one at the Keith home, which Anthony attended. 10 days before the election, bar owners became worried that women's suffrage could mean passage of a law ending the sale of liquor. They quickly helped register thousands of men and instructed them to vote no. The final tally was 247,454 votes, 110,355 for, 137,099 against. The next morning, Anthony said, "I don't care for myself. I am used to defeat. But these dear California women who have worked hard, how can they bear it?" For many years, the suffrage movement languished in California and across America. In 1911, suffragists finally got a referendum back on the California ballot. Young suffragists campaigned in the newly invented automobile and used the telephone to reach voters. On October 10, 1911, 15 years after the events depicted in this book, California became the sixth and largest state to approve women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906. Susan B. Anthony was raised as a Quaker with the belief that men and women are equal. But all around her, she witnessed inequality. Girls who worked at her father's mill couldn't attend school because their families needed their wages. She and the other girls at her school weren't allowed to learn long division. Later, when she became a teacher, she earned only 1/4 the salary of male teachers. All these experiences made her want to work for change. When Anthony was 18 years old, she joined the abolitionist movement after hearing Lucretia Mott speak out against slavery. In 1851, she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton and became devoted to the cause of women's suffrage. Anthony believed that if women could vote, they could help pass laws to end slavery and to improve working conditions and the lives of the poor. For more than 50 years, Susan B. Anthony led the fight for women's suffrage, along with her friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton. While Stanton wrote speeches and raised a family, Anthony campaigned across the country. She first visited California in 1871 and returned several times, including 8 months during the campaign depicted in this book. Even in her later years, Anthony was described as tireless, working night and day. At a celebration of her 86th birthday at the 1906 meeting of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Susan proclaimed her famous rallying cry, "Failure is impossible." In 1896, one woman reporter said she didn't believe in suffrage until she interviewed Anthony. "I wish I were Susan B. Anthony," she wrote. "There is something lovable in her face and voice. She is beautiful in her plainness, and her smile is not to be forgotten." Susan B. Anthony died in Rochester on March 13, 1906. Memorial services were held all over the country, including one in San Francisco, during which William Keith's portrait of her was unveiled. After Anthony's death, Bessie's aunt, Mary McHenry Keith, and many other supporters around the country lobbied to make her birthday a national holiday. That never happened, but a dollar coin features her likeness. Susan B. Anthony died before all American women won the vote in 1920, 100 years after her birth. But her name is forever linked with the long battle for women's suffrage. Failure is impossible. Suffrage history. Our Constitution states that citizens should be allowed to vote, but it doesn't spell out who is considered to be a citizen. That was left up to each state to decide. In the early days of our country, only male landowners were allowed to vote. Men of color won the right to vote with passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, but women still could not vote. Beginning with the first suffrage convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, women in every state worked to get the vote. The 72-year campaign stretched through 2 wars and 16 presidents. It included 56 state referendum campaigns, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to consider suffrage amendments, 47 campaigns for constitutional conventions, 277 campaigns directed at state party conventions, and 30 campaigns to get national parties to put suffrage in their platforms. In 1878, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was first introduced in Congress, but it wasn't until 1919 that it finally passed both houses of Congress. In August 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. 100 years after Susan B. Anthony's birth, women from every state finally gained the vote. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. 1787. U.S. Constitution leaves voting rights up to the states to decide. Only New Jersey allows women to vote, and only between 1776 and 1807. 1866. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, an organization for white and black women and men dedicated to the goal of universal suffrage. 1869, Wyoming Territorial Legislature grants full voting rights to women. 1870, Utah Territorial Legislature grants full voting rights to women. 1870, the 15th Amendment allows men of color to vote, but not women. 1872, Susan B. Anthony attempts to vote in the presidential election and is arrested. 1883, Washington Territorial Legislature grants full voting rights to women. 1890, Wyoming is the first state to grant full voting rights to women. 1893, Colorado state referendum grants full voting rights to women. 1896, Utah and Idaho grant full voting rights to women. Suffrage referendum defeated in California. 1906, Susan B. Anthony dies. 1910, Washington state referendum grants full voting rights to women. 1911, California state referendum grants full voting rights to women. 1912, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona grant full voting rights to women. 1913, Alaska Territorial Legislature grants full voting rights to women. 1914, Montana and Nevada grant full voting rights to women. 1918, South Dakota and Oklahoma referenda grant full voting rights to women. 1919, U.S. House of Representatives and Senate approved the 19th Amendment granting all American women full voting rights. 1920, the 19th Amendment wins the necessary two-thirds ratification from state legislatures. Yes, I'll tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. I rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. It gives her a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. Susan B. Anthony, 1896.